For the past 10 years, the Call of Duty franchise has absolutely dominated the first-person shooter market, constantly breaking sales records and preserving its spot at the top of the food chain. In the same span of time, dozens of games have crowned themselves as the Call of Duty killer, but all have failed to dethrone the giant. One of these games was Homefront, released in 2011 by THQ and Kaos Studios, which started off pretty promising. However, just like every other game with the same mission, it quickly fell into obscurity the minute the media hype started to die off. Let's discuss how Homefront fell short in today's video game Autopsy. As far as most modern first-person shooters go, Homefront was not like the rest. Instead of focusing on faraway conflicts across the ocean, Homefront brought the battle to Montrose, Colorado, in the heart of American suburbia. Other games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 briefly touched on what an invasion of the United States would look like, but very few games at the time centered an entire story around it. A lot of people looked forward to the story as many grew tired of the conflicts taking place between the United States and a die roll of Russia, Germany, and the general Middle Eastern region. The basic gist of Homefront's backstory revolves around the idea of a weakening United States battling a prosperous North Korea. North Korea starts its nuclear testing in 2011 and starts to gain power under Kim Jong-un after the death of Kim Jong-il, an event that Homefront actually predicted with an estimate accurate to within a year. Shortly thereafter, the Korean peninsula is united and a new regime starts to annex countries for their resources. At the same time, the United States enters an economic recession or depression and tensions slowly start to rise. After Korea's occupation of the Middle East, the United States has its oil supply cut off and gas prices begin to skyrocket. Then the avian flu hits the United States, killing millions of people and weakening its might. Finally, Korea detonates a nuke disguised as a satellite over the United States, creating an EMP that wipes out its power grid, which is actually a scenario I'd love to dedicate an entire video to. Homefront's story centers around Robert Jacobs, a former Marines helicopter pilot, being taken by the KPA or Korean troops who have occupied the western United States after a series of very unfortunate events. As he's headed to a labor camp in Alaska, the resistance rams the bus he's on and rescues him from detainment. They fight their way through the suburbs to a hidden oasis where a group of fighters have partially restored life to. Their plan and central point of conflict of the story revolves around hijacking a convoy of fuel tankers and taking them to the offensive in San Francisco. To do this, they have to get their hands on a couple of trackers and attach them to trucks and then take them over using a helicopter, which is where Jacobs fits in. The setting in which Homefront takes place is super interesting. The game was released in March of 2011, a year after North Korea sank a southern Korean ship, alluded to by the opening cutscene, and a few months after they fired artillery at a South Korean island. At this time, the media was paying a lot of attention to North Korea, a general trend that swells up every year or so, and many people were wondering what would happen if North Korea actually invaded the United States. Homefront came out at just the perfect time and toyed with the scenario that occupied a lot of people's minds. It explored what would happen if a conflict arose in a lot of our backyards, and while the backstory doesn't make that much sense, it does a pretty good job of depicting an occupation by an authoritarian regime. The KPA were ruthless, executing thousands of people and sending thousands more into labor camps, which mimics the events of another authoritarian regime that did the same thing back in the 1940s. What makes this setting so compelling is seeing the destruction and domination of an idea of what you call home. However, while Homefront's story has a premise that is more interesting than the endless conflicts abroad, its actual execution was one of the major flaws of the game. When I did my playthrough of Homefront for this video, I finished the entire game in around 3 hours, and my first thought was, that was it? As far as most AAA shooter games go, this is extremely short. The Call of Duty series generally takes between 6 and 9 hours to finish, Halo takes around 7 to 10, and Battlefield takes between 7 and 8 hours. While those numbers are nowhere near the hours it takes to beat most RPGs, a 6 to 8 hour story length is the genre standard. Homefront rolls in at right around half of that, which makes the game feel like a breeze. Now, a story's quality isn't always proportional to its length, but if a game's story is going to be short, it better be exceptional. Honestly, while there are a few good sequences in the game, Homefront is pretty lacking in the stuff to care about department. The characters fit the generic mold of the jock, the nerd, the humanitarian, and you. Connor's the macho, super tough guy that gets angry and doesn't care about people's feelings. Hopper is the tech guy that fixes computer stuff and hacks into things, and Rihanna is just one of those people that's overly concerned with how everybody feels. And then there's you, the person that just kind of does stuff. Now, having these tropes in the game doesn't have to detract from the story. Battlefield Bad Company 2 had a similar squad, but they played on it in such a way that it made the game super memorable. However, Homefront uses these stereotypes as a template to define these characters and never touches on them again. None of them have a deep backstory that is explored later on, or a shocking realization that changes their outlook, or really any sort of interesting component that makes them memorable. You could swap them out with pretty much anyone, and it would make the game exactly the same. The central conflict of Homefront revolves around hijacking fuel tankers and taking them to San Francisco, and then taking back the Golden Gate Bridge. That is it. There's no central single enemy that they're constantly trying to take down. There's no major twist along the way that changes everything. There's no impressive character arc that makes the story personal. There's a couple of good sequences, like the sniping portion of the 5th mission and some really good helicopter mechanics used in the 6th mission, but nothing within the a game makes it stand apart from any other shooter. Homefront isn't an epic about a band of resistance fighters that turns the tides against an impossible enemy, it's just a single chapter. Plus, the actual gameplay of the single player was pretty damning for Homefront. The friendly AI was extremely awkward, which broke the flow of the game. You have to wait for everyone else to catch up or slowly complete a task before you could follow. Sometimes they would just stand around till they figured out that it was time to move along. The enemy AI always seemed to be super conflicted over what they should be doing the moment a second objective arrives. Pressing a button to climb the whole ladder was weird, especially when you had to wait for the option to become available or other people to climb up the ladder. And these issues made Homefront seem unpolished and a little annoying to play in certain moments. The lack of a compelling story really hurt Homefront's ability to take on the single entity standing in its way of becoming an extremely successful franchise, Call of Duty. Homefront was released in March of 2011, right between the releases of Call of Duty Black Ops and Modern Warfare 3. Call of Duty was right in the middle of its heyday, despite constant criticism of people who found the franchise undeserving of its place in the industry. Modern Warfare 2, while dogged on for its frustrating multiplayer experience, broke sales records and changed the way a lot of developers wrote their single-player campaigns. Instead of creating a minor story taking place at the heart of a military conflict, Modern Warfare 2 created an action movie-esque experience of treachery and constant excitement. Black Ops 2 came around and did it again, but with a much cleaner multiplayer. Even though first-person shooters are primarily bought for their multiplayer, it's hard to reject the significance of both game stories. Call of Duty absolutely dominated the market and created an atmosphere where you had to have an absolute breakout in order to even be considered competition to the franchise. Many games came out vowing to overtake the series, but none of them ever succeeded. In order for Homefront to survive in the market, it needed to be groundbreaking. It needed some major feature that would shake up the industry and persuade players to come over to their side. The multiplayer, while being one of the first games to directly reward objective play in the same way as kills through its battle point system, something that would be adopted by Call of Duty and other series, was regarded as alright. The gameplay was solid and new, but it just lacked that edge it needed to compete. The story, which we just discussed, was just too underwhelming to draw people's attention. There's no central character or moment that stood out as prolific. There wasn't a conflict or sequence that kept people hooked until the end. Generally, the campaign was pretty mediocre when it needed to be outstanding in order to turn heads away from the Goliath that Call of Duty was at the time. Within a couple months, Homefront's appeal began to wear off and the game slowly started to lose its player base. While the game was the most money THQ ever spent on development and Homefront was deemed profitable, selling 2.6 million copies with the goal of selling at least 2 million, the game wasn't really a landmark. In September 2011, just 6 months after Homefront's release and a few weeks before the first round of DLC, THQ announced that Kaos Studios was being shut down and the development of its sequel would be in the hands of Crytek, the developers of the Crysis series. While the game made a profit and had a sequel, Homefront gets an autopsy because of its panned reception, mediocre product, and aftermath, which included the closing of its original studio. Homefront hoped to be the game that would finally dethrone Call of Duty, but even after a hyped release, it was basically forgotten except for the minor blip that its sequel release put on the radar. Plagued with a lackluster story and okay multiplayer, Homefront failed to make a name for itself as a major player within the first-person shooter genre. Thank you guys for watching this episode of Video Game Autopsies. Every week we're going to be discussing the factors that cause a game to fail. If that sounds interesting, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. If you like this video, give me a like and let me know what games you'd like to see covered. This has been iMissTooMuch. Peace.